Well, when all was said and done in qualifying for Spain, it was basically, as we said, in order to get the pole, Valtteri Bottas had to drive the perfect lap in his Mercedes, and he didn't drive the perfect lap because Lewis Hamilton did. Well, he says it was an all right lap. It was an okay lap. The second lap in Q3 wasn't great, but the track was definitely getting slower then. It was getting hotter. It went over 50 degrees centigrade, which is very hot, even by Formula One standards. And we do race in places like, we have raced in places like Malaysia, and of course we go to Abu Dhabi and Bahrain, where we don't race in that temperature, but we certainly run the cars in that temperature. But anyway, getting back to Spain, as I said, Valtteri had to do the perfect lap. He said afterwards that it was sector 3 where he wasn't able to take it to Lewis. And that was, I had to smile when he said that, because that is classic digital data talk. He's looking at the data. Oh yeah, sector 3, Lewis is quicker. What's he doing there? Well, I can tell you he's doing nothing different from you there, Valtteri. He's just got a slightly higher grip level going into sector 3. And the reason he's got a slightly higher grip level is because he's not using the tyres quite as much through sector 1, particularly out of turn 2 into 3, which is where Valtteri was still doing what we kind of predicted. He was coming out and then making the entrance into 3 just a little bit wider than Lewis, asking a lot of the left rear. Great car control, lovely positioning of the car in terms of where he wanted it to be, but he wasn't doing what Lewis was doing there. Lewis was manipulating the car in the middle of turn 2, as we said he would, getting the car slightly straighter, coming out of 2 and requiring nothing like as much of the car going into 3. And that is where he didn't use the tyres as much, and that is where by the time he got to sector 3 he had more of the tyres with which to finish the lap. Now, you know, Valtteri, it's odd, I think, that Valtteri would still think in terms of numerical segments and say, well, it must be sector 3, what is Lewis doing there? If he does that, he'll drive himself mad, because as I say, there is nothing that he could find through sector 3. There's no way in the world. Through sector 3, it's a fairly banal piece of racetrack. There's not much any racing driver who's really good can do to beat another there. Okay, that long right-hander, Sebastian Vettel, with his V style of driving, is probably the quickest guy through that specific corner. And you may find a driver or two who's really, really good over the curbs in that last bit. But generally speaking, it's not that demanding. It's sector 1 that defines the lap in Barcelona. And if you can save the tyres in a qualifying lap through sector 1, it will reward you with a higher grip level in sector 3, which is exactly what we saw today. So a fabulous lap again by Lewis Hamilton. I'm not sure he knew how, because he does this so naturally. He's just thinking, well, here's the grip level in sector 3. I'll just drive the sector 3 and that's it. Oh, I'm on the pole. Brilliant. And that's kind of as simple as Lewis is, but it's all happening because of that wonderful manipulation he's got out of turn 2 into 3 in sector 1. I suspect that's come from, this is only my opinion, it's probably come from Ferrari. They feel that they've lost their engine tweak from last year, and therefore wouldn't it be good if Mercedes stopped turning up the engine in qualifying now? A bit of quid pro quo there probably. Anyway, the FIA have said that. Personally, I think that's a good thing. I don't see the point of having all these different maps. If we're not going to have qualifying tyres in the sense that they do one lap only in the way we used to have them in a tyre war when it was Firestone versus Goodyear or Bridgestone versus Michelin, if we don't have that, we're in a tyre monopoly. We don't have qualifying tyres. We have a soft tyre, but it's a raceable tyre. If we don't have qualifying tyres, why do we have qualifying maps in the engine? It doesn't make any sense to me. But the interesting thing, getting to the point now, is that the two factory Mercedes were not actually that quick in a straight line through the speed trap in Barcelona. So Lewis Hamilton, fastest through the speed trap in Q3, when supposedly they would have turned up the boost, 317 kilometers an hour. Valtteri Bottas 318. The two racing points, 321. Carlos Sainz 321. Lando Norris 320. And then you've got Charles Leclerc and the Red Bulls at about the Mercedes speed. So they still had the pole. In fact, their margin over Red Bull on this occasion was 0.6 if you take it to Lewis, which is actually slightly larger than we've seen in recent races. I'm talking Lewis to Red Bull now. So even though they're about the same in top speed. From Max's point of view, the result of the speed trap is quite encouraging, because it means that in the race condition, potentially, if he's in a DRS situation, for example, it's not going to be too bad for him. His speed is commensurate with that of Mercedes. The problem, of course, is going to be the two racing points, which are much quicker in a straight line. And if he can't stay ahead of them, certainly at least one of them, in the early laps, it could be a really bad day for Max tomorrow, because that speed advantage that the racing point have is very, very significant. So yeah, Max Verstappen, another perfect day at the office. No mistakes at all, looked very clean, just like Lewis all weekend. Valtteri always a little bit more ragged when he's on a really, really quick lap. And Racing Point, as predicted, Sergio PEREZ right back into it straight away. I mean, his first flying lap yesterday was quicker than just about anybody's. It was just brilliant to watch him getting back into the car and how good he is, how in harmony he is with the car around Barcelona. And I think tomorrow in race conditions with the heat and with everything else going on, as I said a few videos ago now, I think that Sergio's touch with the throttle, the way he loads or doesn't load the loaded rear of the car, will be one of the big advantages he has. Lance Stroll did a good job too, as he was always going to do. As I said, around Barcelona, he's done 1 million laps here, so he was always going to be up there. Ferrari looked pretty good yesterday, and as predicted, Sebastian Vettel was a lot nearer to Charles on this sort of circuit, which rewards his style of driving much more than Austria-Hungary or Silverstone. He was much nearer, although Charles always had the slight edge because he's so good with his mid-corner manipulation. But Seb was almost there, and he didn't make Q3, but he only failed by 0.2 of a second, which isn't that much, I guess, around Barcelona. But that was the dividing line between making it through and not. So obviously not a great day for Sebastian Vettel, and it didn't take him long, again as predicted, to say, oh yeah, this new car feels much better than the old car. Of course he feels better in the new car because he's on a circuit that actually he can drive around for a change, as distinct from Silverstone, when he doesn't have a back end and he was completely lost. Yep, the new car, Seb, it's all in the new car. What happens when the new car becomes an old car? Oh, won't ask that question. Ferrari also slow in a straight line, and say Charles Leclerc 3.15 compared with, say, Valtteri Bottas 3.18. They've had to trim the car a lot even to achieve that, so it will be difficult for them to keep their tyres intact, but there are very few drivers on the grid as good as Charles Leclerc as keeping the tyres together. He was saying after qualifying though that the car has terrible understeer, and it was worse actually when he put on the final new set in the second part of Q3. To me, that's just an indication of how much wing they've taken off the car. They don't have much grip. And yeah, it can be understeer, it can be oversteer, depending on where the balance is. You can have a balanced car with very low grip level, but there's not much point. If you've got a driver as quick as Charles, you try to make at least some part of the car work, whether it be traction or turn-in. He didn't have the turn-in for his Q3 lap, so all credit to him to do the job that he's doing. Another superb performance, I thought, by Charles Leclerc. His corners are just going on for so much longer than Max Verstappen's. I mean, I don't know what the engineers are doing there. At one point, his engineer, Simon Rennie, I guess it was, got on the radio and said to Alex, you could gain a bit of time by braking a bit later into turn 10. Well, I would have thought that's about the worst possible advice you could give to Alex Albon, because what you don't want is this guy braking late. And if he's braking early, just come out of the brakes a bit earlier. And in contrast, I thought that the information given to Carlos Sainz, which was make your inputs lovely and soft, you're doing a great job, Carlos, that's exactly the sort of information that Alex should be getting. He doesn't need to know that Max is a little bit quicker through turn 5, which is that tight left-hander. What does that mean? You know, in the middle of the corner, the entry to the corner, is he braking later? Has he just got the power on sooner? Has he got the car straighter? Is he manipulating the car? There's so many different things that can be going on there. But the point is, Alex isn't on top of that. And this is all coming from, I think, from switching engineers. I've got absolutely no criticism at all. Who am I to make any criticism of any of the engineers in the Formula One pit lane? I think they're all geniuses, they're all brilliant, and they make me feel like a dunce whenever I talk to them. But I will say this, I feel really bad for the engineer who's not now working with Alex Albon, because I don't think it would be any different, to be honest with you. But there you go. I don't see how this, oh, you're doing a great job, try and brake a bit later. I don't see how that works for a driver like Alex Albon. It might work for Max Verstappen, but it doesn't work for Alex because he's got too many other inherent faults in his driving, and he's not addressing those, or Red Bull aren't telling him to address them, I suppose is the way to phrase it. Yeah, another great performance by McLaren. You know, yesterday, if you looked at the times yesterday, and I got a bit of flack actually from some of the viewers saying, oh, why didn't you mention Daniel Ricciardo more or some of the other midfielders? Well, to my eye, it always looked as if McLaren were doing their homework yesterday and really focusing on what needed to be done. And so it proved, you know, when it came down to qualifying, getting the car ready for a quick lap, they did the job again, and absolutely superb. I thought when you can have both drivers doing an identical lap time and you've got your Spanish driver in Spain just ahead of your English driver, probably for the first time this year, I think. I don't know, but certainly it's been a while. It's a job well done. So absolutely full marks to McLaren, Renault for that. Superb. The Renault factory team kind of looked good yesterday with a very quick lap towards the end by Daniel Ricciardo. As I suggested, you know, he's probably one of the best curb drivers in Formula One. And I think that Sector 3, just in terms of using the curbs well, is a great bit of road for Daniel Ricciardo. And he's a great race driver too, in so many ways, of pacing his race and feeling and his feel for the gaps in the traffic. But speaking of gaps in the traffic, it was that was a nasty shunt that Esteban Ocon and the other Renault had in FP3 this morning. He basically just ran into the back of Kevin Magnussen, who the stewards say should be excused because he had been looking to move over and he had already backed off and wasn't braking, but the whole hybrid thing was slowing the car down dramatically. And meanwhile, Esteban was coming up and he was looking in his mirrors to see if there's anybody behind him. When he looked up, the Haas was going so slowly, he just ran straight into the back of it. Well, yeah, okay, and no one was to blame, therefore. I don't really buy that either. I think if you're on a slow lap, in other words, you're not on a racing lap, you should be off the racing line. You should be constantly looking in the mirrors, and you should make it very, very clear for anybody potentially behind you where you should be passed. We learnt that lesson, sadly, when Gilles Villeneuve ran into the back of Jochen Mass, when Jochen didn't tell him which side to pass, and then at the last moment moved over on Gilles, who just decided to go on the right-hand side. We've had that accident. We lost a great life. It should never happen again. And it did kind of happen again. That exactly the same accident kind of happened today. It was slightly different in that Esteban probably had his eyes slightly off the ball. He's looking at the mirrors, and Gilles, of course, wasn't looking at his mirrors. He's just looking dead straight ahead of him at Jochen Mass. But nonetheless, if Kevin Magnussen had been to the inside of the track where he should have been, Esteban Ocon would have seen that. He's on a slow lap. He would have moved to the inside. Maybe he would have passed him, looked in his mirrors, and none of it would have happened. I think we're so disciplined now in terms of the fines and the regulations and what you can do under braking, weave, double weave, bring the car back to the, whatever it is. We're not disciplined enough in telling drivers what to do when they're not on a quick lap. If you're not on a lap, get off the racing line. And guess what? There's another Red Bull driver out there called Pierre Gasly, who is really doing a superb job for Alpha Tauri Honda. Pierre is a driver very much in the mould of Max Verstappen. He's short corners, he's straight lines. Of course, he has a few rough edges on him. He's still relatively young, and he hasn't had the same career as some of them, telling him how wonderful he is all the time. He's had the right brakes kind of at the right time, but he did have to go to Japan to race Super Formula there, where he did really well, particularly in difficult conditions on really tough circuits. But Pierre is a driver with a lovely linear feel to him. And watching him out of 2 into 3, yeah, he didn't have the same mid-corner manipulation, but he was certainly not asking a lot of the car going into 3. Esteban Ocon, surprisingly, was asking a lot more. Daniel Ricciardo was asking more of the car into 3 than Pierre Gasly. And I think racing ultimately isn't that complicated. Maurice Nunn of Ensign always used to say that, there's no magic to racing. And he was right. You know, it is all about being logical, and it's all about looking at the reality of the lap. And the reality of the lap in Barcelona is that in order to be really quick in Sector 3, you've got to look after your tyres through Sector 1 and Sector 2. I'm talking qualifying now. And that's another thing that Pierre Gasly did really well. By the time he got to Sector 3, whether he knew it or not, he had a fairly relatively high grip level in that car. And that's how he did the lap time, because he looked after the tyres well enough without losing a lot of speed through sectors 1 and 2, a bit like Lewis's advantage over Valtteri. So Pierre Gasly, another superb performance. I can remember bumping into him at Goodwood a couple of years ago when he didn't really have a drive at all. He was just about to go off to Japan to do Super Formula, but he was there. He was showing an interest in the history of the sport. He was talking about various drivers from the past, and equally he exuded a confidence which suggested that he knew how quick he was. He just needed to have the right car and the right opportunity. And there he was going off to Japan to race Super Formula, which is not an easy thing to do. The weather, the tracks, the teams, the language, the food, the travel, everything else. But he adapted incredibly quickly. And I think that was a moment when we saw Pierre Gasly and how good he was going to be as a racing driver. It's a long run down to turn 1 tomorrow. It's going to be a drag race between the two Mercedes drivers. Obviously, Valtteri is going to try and get in front of Lewis. You can go around the outside going into 1, but you then need the driver on your right to give way for the apex of 2. And I don't see Lewis doing that. I don't see Valtteri thinking that Lewis is going to do that. And I certainly don't see Toto Wolff wanting his 2 drivers to do that anyway. So probably they'll be going to that in quite a lot of detail. Depends kind of what's going on behind them, whether Max is right with them or whether there's a bit of a gap, and whether Max is getting swamped by the racing points with their Mercedes power or not. Should be an interesting first corner. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Bye.